أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين له بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Praise be to Allah, and peace and blessings upon His Messenger Muhammad and his companions and all those who follow his guidance. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are talking today about Islam and society, or more specifically about how Islam benefits society, or how Islam can benefit society. And when we are talking about society, we can either talk about any society that is perceivable, and we will do that in one way because I want to talk a little bit about what makes a society tick. But more specifically, of course, we shall talk about British society, my starting society, that Islam has something to offer for society, and that Islam, as it is perceived by most Westerners, an Eastern or Oriental or strange system of beliefs, has something to offer for Western society, then we have to look at society whether actually it is in need of any thing that Islam might have to offer. And we also have to look into the origins of society, its problems, how it got there, its relationship to Islam in history and now, and from that deduct what the future might hold. Now, the first thing I want to dispel is that Islam is that alien system of belief. We always, when we talk about Western society, talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. You will hear that quoted a lot in an article in the Times that I love very much because for the first time it advocates an authoritarian liberalism, whatever that might mean, because John Gray, who is a political philosopher at the Jesus College in Oxford, tells us that do Muslims defend their traditions on the grounds of fairness and parity in a tolerant society? If so, we have to agree to them, but if they defend them because they are true, then we have to resist their claim and assert the fundamental values of liberalism. And if necessary, we have to be authoritarian in doing so, which of course, until now, I always thought was the very opposite of liberalism. But what he's saying here is that we cannot accept a truth that denies our way of life. So in this liberal society, you always hear that we are building, like this very same article states many times, on Judaic-Christian values. So we put Judaism and Christianity onto one side. Those are the familiar religions. This is our tradition. This is where we come from. This is where we have our system of values from. And we put Islam on the other side. Those are these barbaric hordes from the east that want to overrun us, that knock at the gates of Vienna, that want to push us out, that want to get us back into the Dark Ages and all that. So this is how it is usually perceived. And of course, like so many pieces of propaganda, it is not even half true. It's like TV advertising. When they sell you a product, they will say all things about their product which are not true, but sound good. And they will say an equal amount of things about other products which are also not true, but all bad. So to make the choice easy for you. Because if you know that this is all good and this is all bad, then you don't have a problem. You know which one to pick from the shelf. And of course the same is happening with ideologies and philosophies. They want to sell their version of the truth, and therefore they have to denounce and vilify any alternative. Now, I'm not for once suggesting, because I am not subscribing to some strange kind of liberalism, that truths are like other products on a supermarket shelf and that you could pick and choose. To the contrary, I do state, and that's why then people like John Gray want to fight us with authoritarian means to defend their liberalism, which is another word for their fanatical secularism. I would state that if there is a truth, then it is absolute. If something is true, then something else that contradicts it cannot be equally true. It has to be rejected. There is only one truth. The truth is absolute. Now I also state that there is only one religion. And that is a religion because if there is God, which I would very much want to profess, and if he guides people, then it is not perceivable that he guides some of them in this direction and some of them in that direction. But he would, of course, call them all to the same way. So there is only one religion. But of course, through human development, it has been, the message has been given to us again and again, and it has been adapted in its language, in its demands, to the circumstances of the time, naturally. But it comes from the same source, and it has the same objective. Now in that, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are not antagonists. If anybody cares to read the Quran, he will find that Islam confirms all the messengers of God, from Adam over Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and all those in between. May peace be with them all. So Islam, as the submission to God, as to deriving peace in the world and with oneself by submission to God, is a natural disposition, is a natural inclination that always has been at the heart of religion. And it is only later that people have actually doctored religion to make it something else. It's happened with Judaism, it's happened with Christianity, and it even has happened with Islam, as we know it today. The Jews have replaced the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, and some other scriptures they had from their prophets, they have replaced them with the Babylonian Talmud, which are teachings that they picked up in captivity in Babylon, what their rabbis taught them, mixed with a lot of black magic and all kinds of other things. And they have adulterated their pure message with one that keeps their rabbis in power. There is a very interesting book that was published by a Holocaust survivor and scientist in Israel by name of Israel Shahak. And in his book, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, The Weight of 3,000 Years, he makes it very, very clear that the rabbis devised a new religion that is not at all in keeping with the original scripture, so that they could control the faithful. He makes it clear in his book that the rabbis actually created a ghetto mentality so that the Jewish faithful could not get away from their influence. And he indicates how, for example, the Kabbalah, which is a Jewish magic derived from the Talmud, tells us that the universe is ruled not by one God but by several deities of various characters and influences, emanated by a dim, distant first cause. Those are his words. So in other words, just like the Quran accuses them of, Jews have fallen back into a form of idolatry, worshipping more than one God, in spite of the 10 Commandments. He tries to dispel the myth that Judaism is a biblical religion, in the sense that the Old Testament in Judaism had the same central place and legal authority which the Bible has for Protestant or even Catholic Christianity. He says that the interpretation of laws is more influenced by the Talmud than by the Bible. The same thing, because I don't want to dwell on this too long, is happening or has happened with Christianity. For example, during the Dark Ages, during the time of the Inquisition, during the time where the church ruled supreme, which is even today manifest in so many sacred church buildings, those monumental structures that were built with the suffering of people who were overawed by the clergy, the church wanted to assert authority. It was a big, I come from a German Lutheran background. It was a big uproar when Luther nailed his thesis. When Luther came up with the idea that we could translate the Bible into a language that people understand, and that it should be printed. Because the priests didn't want people to know what is in the Bible. They wanted people to follow what they were telling them. Christianity became ruled not by the spirit of the teachings of Jesus, peace be with him, which some of it is preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and if anybody studies it, they will find that it is so much closer to what we know today in Islam than to what we are now told is Christianity. Christianity now also an idolatrous system that reflects the pagan gods of Rome and the Osiris cult of Egypt and various other cults of rebirth. Just think of Easter coming up, a fertility rite with Easter eggs and little bunnies. Or think of Christmas with the tree, happening not at some particular important time in the Christian calendar, because those times were doctored, but happening at the winter solstice and then at the spring festival, because it's all orientated around the worship of the sun. And even as I said, Islam has not been entirely immune to all this. We now have the Quran replaced by numerous fatwas, and you can buy them and sell them. And you will always find somebody who will give you a legal opinion that lets you do what you want. So again, whilst Islam as a system does not support a priesthood, is a religion where everybody is responsible for his own deeds, this priesthood has crept back in and demands authority. So when I'm talking about Islam benefiting society, I'm talking about Islam. I'm talking about God-given guidance. I am talking about a system that is designed for our prosperity. I am not talking about man-made digressions from it. I'm not talking about what people might have turned it into or might want to turn it into. And then, still on this theme, we also tend to forget not just that these religions have a common origin, in a spiritual sense, that they all emanate from God, but also that these religions have a common geographical origin. Baby Jesus was not British, nor of any other white European race, as it is depicted in most church pictures you can study. Baby Jesus was Aramean, and baby Jesus grew up in Palestine and had that very complexion that people over there have. Nor was Moses the ordinary Anglo-Saxon. One of his signs was that his hand would turn white without sign of disease, which only makes sense if the man was black. He was brought up in Egypt. He was of Arab stock. Well, he was of Israelite stock, which are the cousins of the Arabs. He was of that complexion. He was tall, dark, with, you could today say, an Afro-Caribbean hairstyle. And he learned his religion from Jethro, his father-in-law, in the Bible described as the Arab priest of Midian. So he's learned his religion from an Arab. God spoke to him in the burning bush in Midian, which is just south of Tabuk, where now is Saudi Arabia. Or let's just call it Arabia, which I think is a little bit better. So we don't get the idea that anybody lays claim on those lands. This is the origin of the Old Testament of the Bible, is in Arabia. That's where God spoke to Moses. So that Islam came from Arabia. Why should Islam be the stranger, but Christianity or Judaism should be familiar? This is propaganda. They both came from the same spot. They both came from the same direction. And Moses' wife was Arab and his children were, well, at least half Arab. Certainly not born to a Jewish mother. So nowadays they would have no rights in the synagogues. So when we talk about religion, of course, religion is being vilified for that very reason that some people want to keep you away because they've got their own brand to sell. It happens in some towns with the mosques, and I'm sure the same happens in other communities, that there is one mosque and then suddenly somebody wants to also be important and he doesn't find a place in the mosque, so he opens another one. So there are two. And they will find some ideological differences over which they argue so they can both justify their existence. And this is what happened on a larger scale in historic terms. That the priesthoods always, to justify their existence, will keep you away from the true religion, because the true religion makes you independent. You relate directly to God. You don't need them in the middle. But then they're out of business. That's bad news if you earn your money like that. Now, I've made a lot of preliminary remarks about religion, so we understand that rightly. Now I'm going to make a couple of preliminary remarks about society. And in the end, I'll thread it all together somehow. Or I'll try anyway. We have, in recent years, increasingly this idea of a world society. There are moves to this global identity, one world. We've got all kinds of one world programs, mostly sponsored by the UN or the Rockefeller Trust. And of course, always look who sponsors something if you want to know what they aim at. But that's beside the point. Socialists in the past have always come across with the idea of internationalism. Capitalists always liked multinational companies, so the two really are after the same. And there's always been this perception that if everybody came under one rule, if everybody was the same, if everybody followed the same patterns, then the world would be a nicer and happier place. If we had a common currency, so it never really works, there's all this bickering about it. If we had a united Europe, but then of course the first problem they think about how to keep the rest out of Europe, all these immigrants who might want to come in, all these asylum seekers, all these people who want a piece of the cake that we stole off them in the first place when we went colonizing them, and then when we exploited their resources, and then when we lent them money that they couldn't pay back and bled them dry for our own advancement, and now they want a share of it, we must stop it. So it's always a lot of talk, but in reality it doesn't figure right. Now, a sound society is something else. Just like a body has a soul, a society somehow also needs an identity. And this is where Allah, for example, in the Quran says, we have made you into nations and tribes so that you would recognize each other. So Islam, when it advocates a brotherhood of people, when it advocates a community where people work together, respect each other, it does not advocate that kind of the-peg cloned personality, where everybody dresses the same, watches the same TV programs, has the same tastes, reads the same paper, and doesn't know who he is and why he is there. This is not the vision of what makes a good functioning society. This is more the total control society. This is more of a fascist stream what we're moving to. This is more of Orwell's nightmare. A society where everybody fits in and is regulated by a bureaucracy far removed from being challenged or approached. When we talk about society, we talk about a manageable entity. We talk about a group of people who feel they belong. And they can only feel that they belong if they have something in common. And you will find no matter what the formal organization of a society is, people will always stick together according to what they have in common. You will always find people spending time with each other because they want to watch football or rugby. And you won't get the rugby goers to watch the football and the football goers to watch the rugby. It just doesn't work that way. You can't tell them you have to have a bit of everything. You will find people grouped together according to their profession, to what they do during the day, according to their interests, according to their race, according to their language, and so on and so forth. People will look for something that they have in common, something that differentiates them from other people, something that makes them out as special. something that identifies them. And unless a society has a common identity, it will not work. And of course, this is something that we see in evidence today. We see our society actually breaking down and disintegrating. There are numerous social problems. Alcohol abuse, drug abuse, people on tranquilizers, increasing incidence of need for psychiatric care. There are numerous problems in the education system. There is a lack of hope. There is unemployment. There are house repossessions. There is a withering infrastructure. There is family breakdown, an increase of one-parent families, and architects start building smaller and smaller apartments for single households. All indicators that this society does not stick anymore. And it doesn't stick anymore because everybody is to himself and his TV or computer game. Because people really don't relate to each other anymore and haven't got much in common anymore. And so you get cyber this and cyber that on the internet. But nothing's real anymore. It's all virtual reality. Or a non-entity. So we do have a problem. We do have a real problem. And that problem is getting worse into the future because we have a generation that's brought up on these ideas of not being tied, of not relating to each other, of not having any sense of commitment to anything, of changing your opinion depending on what gets you there best, of institutionalized hypocrisy. And we got there because we've thrown off what we thought was dispensable, and that is a moral value system. And we've replaced it with what is convenient. So we have a society that, of course, is in need of restructuring or reformation. Now, I want to link the two strains. Because, of course, people, when they say a society is losing its way, would normally say that it ought to go back to its origins. So people like this John Gray and others would argue that we have to, as it were, rediscover and promote the original values that made our society strong. We have to come back to this Judeo-Christian tradition. We have to emphasize the important values of liberalism. We have to shout about the achievements of democracy. We have to defend a free world. And all those catchphrases that are going about. When, of course, the free world means that we are free to do what we like as long as it's at the cost of somebody else. But, of course, it's all centered around a certain group of people. Freedom is a very relative concept. If you haven't got a standard by which to judge, then one freedom to do something offends another person's freedom from having it done to them. So there are people who would argue that we've got to go back to roots. However, the way society has intermingled, the way globally we have movement of people, the way old traditional links have been broken down, Old identities have been destroyed, and back to roots is just no longer possible. It is no longer feasible. And this is where I would argue that when we look for a new identity, when we look for something that can actually pull society out of this spiraling descent into a complete disorientation and chaos, then if we want to go back to roots, we have to actually look at the message from its pure source, rather than after it had been diluted and diluted and diluted. And for that reason, in His mercy, Allah, God, has always reminded us and renewed the information, the message about the right way. So it would never be that we could say we are without guidance altogether. And I would argue that only Islam can provide those answers that our society today so desperately needs. Now, of course, I am not saying that suddenly Islam should come and take over the British Isles, and whether people like it or not, they just have to live by it. I am saying that whatever we gradually find out to be right and good, in the end we discover was there in Islam anyway. We've actually been doing that silly thing where we've got a new machine and we've been trying every button and nothing worked, and eventually we figure out what does what, instead of reading the instructions, which would have saved us all this experimentation and all the disastrous results that had come from it. It's like this saying, if all fails, read the instructions. The instructions are there. And we find that people, when they are fed up with the situation, call for solutions, and that these solutions, if they make sense, if they are proven, eventually bring us back to what was designed for us. We've come full turn. We've had a society that challenged God. Western society, when it borrowed scientific methodology from the Muslims in Andalusia in Spain, used it to challenge God, who for them was the God of the Christian priests, was an unjust God, and they had to challenge him because their priests wouldn't let them practice their science, which they wanted to practice for the benefit of people. And when they challenged him, they threw out the famous baby with the bathwater. And then they started trying things out, and most of the time got it quite wrong. And then they corrected it. And eventually came full circle and realizing that what they had been told in the first place was quite right. The latest discoveries about genetics tell us that mankind derives from one single pair. There are no various origins of man from different apes that matured. There is one origin of man. The latest genetic results tell us also that Darwin, well, he did what he was paid for, but he wasn't truthful. And he was utterly wrong. Yes, he for some time fooled people into that myth of evolution, that things get better as we progress, and therefore we, the European colonizers, are the best race on earth. That's what he was meant to prove. But genetics tell us now that there is no link between the different species, that there is development within species, but there is no link between them. The latest results from the Hubble Space Telescope tell us things about the universe that throw out most of the theories of how it had come about. that make us realize that there are dimensions beyond what we ever perceived, that it has been created, and also that it will be rolled up again. And so we keep getting answers from everywhere that confirm what we should have known in the first place, but we're too proud to accept. The latest discovery of the Ark of Noah, or the remnants of it, on Mount Judi in eastern Turkey. The recent discovery of Mount Sinai in its original location in Midian, not where Constantine's mother located it because she had to find a place, not on the Sinai Peninsula, as if the Banu Israel, the children of Israel, had fled from Egypt into Egypt. No, they fled across Aqaba, not across the Gulf of Suez into Midian, and this is where relics were found. But of course these people were doctoring the truth. It is not known to Christians that Constantine, a non-Christian ruler, presided over a council in Nicaea in 325, established the doctrine of the Trinity, and out of a few hundred Gospels threw out but 4, which he thought he could live with. And they became church dogma. We've been cheated all along. So Islam, the Quran, the message that has been preserved and has so beyond doubt, and there is evidence for that, written evidence, historic evidence, gives us an idea of how we can live our lives in harmony and without suffering. As far as society is concerned, Islam tells us, as I said earlier, that we are made into nations and tribes to know each other. So Islam values people's individuality. Islam values people's identification so that they can compete with each other in good works, as it is stated. Islam also tells us that God has created man and honored him, so there is a human dignity. And without that human dignity, there is no happy society. The reason that people are frustrated, the reason that people get involved in criminal activities, the reason that people go, and like in Scotland today, into a classroom and shoot 20 people and then themselves, is born out of that frustration of not knowing who I am and why I am. When people are stripped of their dignity, they become animals. And they are capable of all kinds of things. And we have, as a society, yes, we have a perfection in how we do things, but we've lost our dignity. There is no longer a dignified way of living. There are too many things around us that offend human dignity and morality and decency. So Allah tells us He has dignified, honored humankind. And any society that wants to prosper has to uphold that dignity. And to uphold that dignity, we have to have that nucleus of a society, the family. Because when children are born, the first thing that they learn about themselves, about their environment, about human relations is from their family. And if they are born to a family that consists of a father and a mother and maybe brothers and sisters, and maybe there are extended relatives to that, then they live in a world where they gain confidence. If they are born into a family that is made up of a divorced parent marrying yet another divorced parent, it's quite a different story. And if they are born into a family where two gay people marry each other and then have difficulty explaining where the child came from, then they have yet another story. So, it does matter what world we bring our children into. And therefore, again, Islam has quite an emphasis on the honor of the family. You see, in Western society, there is, of course, protection of property and life to a degree. There are some who are exempt from it. On the downside, there are those who are exempt in the sense that they're too poor and don't matter, and you can do with them what you like. And on the upper side, there are those who are exempt because they're too rich and too well off, so they can do what they like. But on the whole, there is protection of life and property. But there is no protection of dignity. There is no honor. In Islam, a person's life, property, and honor are sacred and have to be defended by the state. They are inviolable. There is no case for vilification, character assassination, pulling people through the mud. It is a concept that Western society could not understand at the time of the Satanic Versus row. And even so that was badly handled by the Muslims, their complaint, their grievance was a genuine one. That people have a right to maintain their honor. That you can argue over issues. That you can argue over opinions. But you may not vilify people. You may not rubbish people and call them all kinds of things. You may not strip away from them their honor, whether individually or collectively. So we have a family unit that is so very, very important if a society wants to prosper. And then we know from a great variety of traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the great value, the great importance of education. When he says that the best that a father can teach his child is good manners. It's not that you must make sure your child has a PhD and earns lots of bucks. It's the best that the father can teach a child is good manners. And we know from many other traditions how important knowledge is to the quality of life, which of course then is a sad thing to witness that we now have a government headed by a person who prides himself not to have any education and does his best to destroy the education system of the country. Because only when you have an education, only when you have knowledge, can you make an informed decision. Can you appreciate the things around you? Can you enjoy what life has to offer? So manners and education is what makes people cultured. Culture is not how you dominate people, how you attack them with the latest weapon systems and threaten and bully them into compliance, or how you buy them out in the markets. Culture is manners and education, how you behave in a dignified way. And then Islam has the next concept, where it brings families together, where it makes people work together for a common goal. And that is the whole concept of charity. Charity where we learn to feel responsible for those next to us, whether they be our neighbors, whether they be wayfarers, travelers, whether they be strangers. Nowadays we don't respect travelers unless they're tourists and leave money behind. But if they're not tourists, we don't want to see them. There is no trust Because everybody is in it for themselves. Everybody is after their own advancement. Everybody against each other. Whereas Islam promotes everybody for each other, in support of each other. It teaches us that a wall is made of bricks. And only if those bricks fit together and stick together is the wall strong. Otherwise they're just bricks. It is a different mentality. It is a different philosophy, a different way of looking at things, a different attitude to life, an attitude where we are not masters of our own fate, where we are not free to do what we want unless somebody stops us, an attitude where we are trustees of what God has given us, where we are responsible, where we will be asked about it, what we have done to benefit not just ourselves but other people from the things that he has provided, to look after it, to maintain it for the future generations, to take care of it properly, to sustain it. There is a lot of concern nowadays of environmental damage, a lot of concern about the destruction we do to our own environment, that we don't care about even the next generation. Here you have a vivid demonstration of it with what happened in Pembrokeshire with the oil spill, where the irresponsibility of people who are only interested in balance sheets leads to not taking care of warnings of what can happen if precautions aren't taken. Likewise, we have warnings about old rolling stock on the railways likely to cause more fatal accidents because we do not invest in improvements. But of course we need to save money rather than lives. We need to save money rather than values. We need to save money rather than health. And that is, of course, because this money has become a fetish itself. It has become something that is sought after for its own benefit. That money that is only a piece of paper, a fraudulent piece of paper at that. Because it is an empty promise. If everybody wanted to take their money out of the banks today, they would find it isn't there. And it won't buy them anything. Because banks lend you 100-fold of what they've got, knowing that it will not all be called in at once. Now, if I promise you something I haven't got, then this is fraudulent. If the banks do it, it is called credit creation. And it goes so far that even the government must borrow from them what they haven't got and pay interest through our taxes back to them for what they haven't got. But if somebody comes and suggests that the government should create its own money, then they say, no, you can't do that. The banks can, but you can't. That'd be bad. Cause inflation, all kinds of things. Well, it would be bad, but only for those who currently have a monopoly on credit and money creation. They are fooling us again. So again, Islam teaches us that there has to be justice in human dealings. There has to be justice in the economic system. There has to be fairness in how people relate to each other. That everybody is a brother to another, and a brother does not cheat. A brother does not outdo him in business. A brother does not say something about him he would not like to hear. So fairness, justice, dealing with everybody according to the same standard, no matter whether he is the ruler or whether he is at the bottom of the range. The examples of Islamic history, where, for example, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he reconquered Mecca after they had thrown him and the believers with him out, and he reconquered Mecca without taking revenge. And on the eve of it, he was walking, and he saw an old lady who was getting her things together, wanting to leave the town. And he said, why are you doing that? what's wrong? And she said, well, this Muhammad is taking the town. There will be bloodshed, there will be suffering, there will be problems. I better go. And he said to her, you shouldn't worry, he's not such a bad man and he won't do that. She said, no, I don't trust anybody. There is always bloodshed when people take towns. So he said, well, can I help you carry your stuff for you then? And so he carried her stuff for her until she got out of town and helped her and talked to her nicely, and then she settled. She asked him, well, you are very kind, what's your name? And he said, well, I am Muhammad. She said, Muhammad who? He said, Muhammad the son of Abdullah. What, are you the one who is taking the town? He said, yes. You see, when there is no difference, when the Caliph Umar, when he took Jerusalem, and the leaders of town didn't recognize him because they were riding on a mount and they were taking turns. Yes, 3 people to 1 camel, yeah? And everybody gets a ride on the way. And when they came into Jerusalem, it wasn't his turn to ride, it was his turn to walk. And they wouldn't recognize him, they wouldn't think he is the Caliph, he is the leader. These are the examples that we aspire to, where there has to be fairness, where there has to be justice, where people do not take false privileges on account of their perceived position. Where rulers are not above the law, where MPs are not immune from prosecution. This is a different situation. Then, of course, you get rid of a lot of grievances. You have a coherent society, because people will comply with what their rulers tell them if their rulers don't just say tighten your belt, but they tighten their own as well. But then, of course, if you have a sound monetary and economic system, there might not be a need to tighten the belts, because there is prosperity around us. We have plenty of it. We're just destroying it ourselves. It's not that we don't grow food. We pay farmers not to grow it. And then we dump some in the sea to keep the price up. And then we talk about there is overpopulation. We can't feed all the people. But we really mean there are too many of them and too little of us. So Islam has a different view of what makes people cooperate and work with each other and for each other. It can only be done if we respect each other. And that can only be done if we all feel responsible for what we do to a higher norm, to a creator. If we realize that this life is not an end in itself, but it terminates in another life in which we will have to reflect and answer for what we have done over here. So you have the family, made up of dignified individuals, tied into a network of trust, where you don't have to install a separate phone system to listen on your wife's phone calls or the wife on the husband's phone calls because you don't know who's coming round next. You have these families working together for a common purpose, varying education, varying culture, cooperating, being charitable. And it all sounds like an ideal that cannot be realized. But those people, like myself and many others, who have made the transition from a non-Islamic way of life to an Islamic way of life, they know it is possible. And so, to round it up, I quote you from a little article that was published in the Evening Standard. You've all heard the story of that girl from Essex who went to Turkey on a holiday and then got married to a waiter when, of course, according to most people here, all she should have done is have an affair with him and come back and show the photographs. Now this girl is an example of somebody consciously making that decision. She says, in England I feel ugly. But in Turkey I feel beautiful and loved. Because in England, of course, she was what wasn't exactly the latest standard in fashion. And people don't matter as people or as persons. It matters how well they conform. And this is what makes this commentator, an exception amongst the rest, say that she looks rather better in the hijab or scarf than she does in her school photo. She may have been mocked in Essex for her homely appearance and large feet, but in the Near East that schoolgirl complexion has at least some rarity value. And while conversion to Islam is a serious business, she does not appear to have forsaken any coherent set of beliefs for her new faith. Rather, she has given up a life enlivened, she tells us, by neighbors, home and away, and Madonna, for a traditional, if circumscribed, existence in Turkey. She will at least learn how to cook. If she had enjoyed a lively sex life in Braintree, no social worker in the county would have worried so long as the sex was unproductive. Her sin was to get married. Yeah? So there is a 13-year-old who challenges this system, who had the courage to make the choice and say, no, not for me, I do something else. And then, of course, the British courts that have plenty of 13-year-olds in this country who are getting abused outside marriage, not in marriage. Plenty of 13-year-olds to worry about, plenty of 13-year-olds to rescue. The courts in this country, because they can't handle that the 13-year-old should be mature enough to choose a different way of life over and above the one that we tell her is the ideal. The British courts have to make, of course, all the effort to get her back, to separate her from the person she loves, to give her an education of home and away and neighbors, to push her back into the place where she is made to feel ugly. It's very important. The principle of law has to be upheld here. And of course the Turkish government, daft as they are, they have to comply as well, don't they? Because they always think that their system is substandard. They always think what is in the West is better. They always think we have to follow suit. When this one 13-year-old girl knew quite well that it was the other way round. So it is a decision that people even that young can take. And it doesn't take much. But of course, the moment you do it, they will all be out against you, warning you off, telling you about Islamic fundamentalism, telling you about terrorist activities, telling you about what these Muslims will do to you if they catch you, telling you about cutting hands and slitting throats and whatever. So be warned. Not be warned of Islam, not of the real pure Islam, not of the practice of it, but be warned of those people when they find out what they will do to you. That is the real problem when you choose that path, when you decide to make a change. I know that very well when I became a Muslim, and I think many young people who become Muslims today have a similar experience. You could easily come home to your parents and say, Mom, I'm on drugs. All right, son, we'll do something about it. Or, Mom, I think I'm gay. All right, son, we'll sort it out. Or, Mom, I've got in troubles with the law. Never mind, we'll get a solicitor. But you come home and say, Mom, I've become a Muslim. What? One of them? And they don't talk to you for quite some time. That's that's getting just beyond what is acceptable. Not as if Muslims were such evil living people. Well, they're not criminals, they're not gay, they're not on drugs. I can list the whole range, but mustn't touch it. It's dangerous, it's addictive as well. You know, very addictive. Being good, being decent, feeling dignified, feeling good. Wanting to help people, very addictive, mustn't do it. I leave you with those thoughts, and I'm open for your questions. Assalamu alaikum.